Hi, everyone, and welcome to this small business update. I'm Jeanette Mulvey, the Content Director of CO from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The Biden administration has just announced major changes to the PPP program. These changes are meant to help minority-owned businesses and some of the country's smallest businesses access the program. We're here today to break down the details of these changes and talk about how they might affect you. I'm joined today by the White House's National Economic Council Deputy Director, Bharat Ramamurti, for the inside scoop on the new rules. And later, I'll be joined by U.S. Chamber Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer, Neil Bradley, who will give you advice and insight into taking advantage of the Paycheck Protection Loan for your business. We'll be taking your questions later on in the program, so be sure to type those into the space on the right-hand side of your screen. We have more questions coming in than we can possibly answer, so there are moderators working behind the scenes to ensure that questions that are the most popular are being published. And if you see your question listed as pending, don't worry, they're working hard to get through those. To start today's show, I'd like to welcome Bharat Ramamurti, Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. Bharat, thanks so much for joining me from the White House today.
Well, not quite the White House, but I appreciate it.
No one would have known. You could have faked it. Thanks so much. All right. So the administration has announced these changes starting yesterday for the next 2 weeks. Only very small businesses, meaning businesses with 20 employees or fewer, will be able to apply for the PPP loan. So let's start there. Tell us a little bit about that. Why was that decision made? And what's the thinking behind that?
Sure. So first, thanks for having me on today to talk about this with all of your members, and it's good to talk with you all. The president has been clear that his goal is to make sure that relief money gets to the very smallest businesses, mom and pop businesses. 98% of businesses in this country have fewer than 20 employees. And what we've seen in previous rounds of small business relief since this pandemic started is that getting to those very small businesses has been hard. We all know that some of these small businesses, they don't necessarily have lawyers and accountants on staff. Making sure that they get access to small business relief can be challenging. And so what the president wanted to do is make sure that we had a 2-week exclusive window starting yesterday and running through March 9th, during which lenders had to focus on working with the smallest companies, and those are under 20 employees. Our hope is that with a concerted effort from lenders, from the White House, from the administration generally, that we can really get the word out to these businesses that there's an opportunity to apply for PPP, that we can get you relief quickly, and that we can stop some of the business closures that we've seen around the country. We've lost 400,000 small businesses already. A disproportionate number of those are Black and minority-owned and women-owned. It's fundamentally changing the character of our communities, and I think the president feels strongly that we need to move quickly to target relief to those very smallest companies.
Right. So you mentioned Black-owned businesses and women-owned businesses. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because I know this move was specifically designed to address getting some of this funding to them. So can you talk about that and why this will make it easier for them to access that funding?
Sure. So the data that we've seen shows that Black-owned, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses tend to be smaller on average than other types of businesses. So by limiting this to businesses under 20 employees, we're hopefully targeting relief to those types of firms. Another big change that we announced that will take effect in the days ahead is a change in how we provide relief to sole proprietors, so non-employer firms. There is data showing that 70% of non-employer firms are women and minority-owned, but only 40% of employer firms are women and minority-owned. And the way that the PPP worked previously for sole proprietors was that some were ineligible altogether, and others were eligible only for a very, very small amount of relief because of the way that relief was calculated. We announced changes on Monday to broaden eligibility and to make sure that your PPP loan amount is based on the gross income line in your tax filing, which is going to provide much more support to these categories of businesses, which, as I said before, are disproportionately likely to be women and minority owned.
Right, right. So an interesting component of this is not just that you are asking banks to focus on those applications exclusively, but that you're asking lenders to go out and seek out those companies with 20 employees or fewer. So can you address that, please, and explain how and why?
Sure. Again, and this is understandable, but I think lenders, when the PPP was announced, their first instinct was to serve their existing clients, which again, I understand, and that going out and trying to find other firms that are eligible but not existing clients can be time consuming. And I know for the smallest firms, the fees that banks generate may not be overwhelming compared to other revenue streams. But we feel like we are in the midst of a national crisis, and it's incumbent on everyone, including lenders, to try and play their part. And that means going out, trying to find people in the community that they serve that are that need help, that are eligible for help, and working with those people to make sure that they can get PPP. And what we will do in return is dedicate real time and energy and resources at the SBA and across the administration to spreading the word about these opportunities and to try and make sure we process these loans as quickly as possible so we get relief to people. We're all in this together. It's going to be a joint effort to really make sure that these types of businesses receive relief. And I think that without swift action, the concern is that, as I said before, we're going to lose a lot of those mom and pop shops that are the backbone of the community that they serve.
Yeah. So let's talk about the PPP program more broadly. Do you expect other changes to be coming? I know a lot of people have asked us in these events in the past if the program might be extended beyond the originally planned deadline. So what's happening there?
Well, the American Rescue Plan, which is the bill that's moving through Congress right now, it does have a couple of changes to PPP. Number one, at the moment, it includes new eligibility for larger nonprofit organizations. So that'll mean some new types of firms are going to be swept in and potentially eligible. It also includes about $7 billion, I believe, in additional funding for PPP, in part to account for that new set of eligible companies. Congress at the moment has not decided to extend the March 31st eligibility. Of course, that's up to Congress. It's not something that we in the administration can do by ourselves. We are closely monitoring the data in terms of how much money is left in the program, how are we projecting that money to last over the next several weeks. And we are sharing that data with Congress regularly, so they're aware of it too. If Congress wants to raise the possibility of extending the program, I think we're certainly open to it, and we'll work with them to figure out what's appropriate in that situation. But at the moment, there is no plan in place to extend past March 31st. I just want to make one other thing clear. I know that there are firms that are PPP eligible but are bigger than 20 employees. Obviously, they cannot apply during this 2-week exclusivity period, but there's still going to be plenty of time after March 9th and plenty of money available to make sure that those firms can apply and get relief before the March 31st deadline.
Oh, I'm glad you made that point because I was going to ask you about that. One question I have is if this is a couple of questions. If you applied previously and either didn't get approved or got a very small amount, I assume you can reapply now either for your first or your second PPP loan under these changes?
SBA is trying to work that out administratively. There are actually some statutory provisions that make that challenging, and the SBA is trying to figure all of that out right now. We understand the desire, for example, if you're a sole proprietor who applied and got a certain amount of money, now under these rule changes are eligible for more. Totally understand the desire to want to reapply and get access to that new money. The SBA is seeing what they can do to work within the rules that Congress has created, and which obviously the SBA itself can't change.
Yeah, I think there were some other changes that were implemented for this program as part of this that we haven't talked about. So maybe you can talk about those. I know there were some related to people, immigrant-owned businesses, and also businesses maybe owned by people who had been previously incarcerated. Can you talk about those?
Sure. In addition to the steps that I mentioned already, we took several steps that are intended to get rid of restrictions that we think are unnecessary and blocking relief to people who deserve it. The first one is that PPP, the law is clear that any legal U.S. resident is eligible to apply. And that includes non-citizens like green card holders, people with visas, and so on. Obviously, this is a big issue in the immigrant community. And so we have clarified that if you are a U.S. resident and non-citizen, you can apply using your ITIN number, and you don't need a Social Security number to apply. Number two, currently under PPP, if you are in delinquency or default on your federal student loans, which unfortunately millions and millions of people are, you would be ineligible to apply. And our view is that that's an unnecessary restriction, and we're moving to get rid of it, in part because we want to make sure that those business owners get relief, and in part because it doesn't help repay anybody's federal student loans if they lose their business at the same time. Number three, as you noted, there was a restriction in place set up by the prior administration that anybody who had been convicted of a felony within the last year, regardless of the type of felony and regardless if they had already done their time, was barred from participating in the program. There was a bipartisan bill in the U.S. Senate to get rid of that restriction, and we've decided to adopt that administratively to make sure that if you've served your time, you can participate in this program, and at the same time retaining the previous restriction that if you've been found guilty of a fraud-related felony, that you are restricted from using the program.
Great. I wanted to go back to talking about businesses like sole proprietors and contractors, and this making it a little bit easier for them. I think there's a lot of confusion among those businesses about whether they qualify or not, and particularly there's some question about whether you need to show that you've lost revenue this year, in 2020 versus 2019. Even though I've been covering this a long time, I find myself still getting confused by this. So could you clarify that issue? Do you need to show a revenue loss?
The answer is yes, and I want to make sure that I don't go beyond what I know from SBA. The 25% revenue loss test applies across the board for eligibility for PPP. And of course, there are different ways that Congress and the SBA have contemplated for calculating that. I'm happy to get back to you and your members with more details on this. It's obviously an important question. But my understanding is that the revenue loss test is going to apply to sole proprietors, though there may be a different way of calculating what a revenue loss means in that context.
Yeah, I'm going to talk to Neil Bradley after this, and I have a feeling he's going to have the exact answer. So I will ask him that question as well. We tend to talk about PPP loans a lot because it's an exciting program and it's been very helpful to small businesses. But there are all sorts of issues impacting small businesses in general, even pre-pandemic, but certainly during the pandemic and now as we come out of the pandemic and they recover. Can you talk more broadly about the Biden administration's approach to small businesses and what other kinds of assistance you think that they need and what might be coming down the line?
Sure. I think that honestly, the number one thing that we can do for small businesses and for the economy in general is get the virus under control as quickly as possible. The Biden administration has significantly stepped up the rate of vaccinations since the president took over, has secured 600 million doses of the vaccine, which is enough to get 2 shots to everybody, every adult in the country before the end of the summer. These are important improvements, and I think the key to getting people feeling safe so they can go out and spend money in their communities again. There is additional relief that we are teeing up in the American Rescue Plan that's moving through Congress right now. There's $15 billion in grants, so not loans, but grants to the hardest hit businesses. So those are, in businesses in low and moderate income communities, businesses that in areas like hospitality, restaurants that have been particularly hard hit. There's also, and this is very important to the president, a $10 billion down payment on what he calls the Small Business Opportunity Fund. The Opportunity Fund reflects the idea that we got to make sure that businesses survive over the next several months and come out the other side of the pandemic. But then there's a lot of rebuilding to do after that. And so the Opportunity Fund leverages private dollars at the state level, in some cases up to 10 to 1, so that there's working capital available for small businesses. So if you're a small business owner who maybe lost your business during the last several months, could be money available for you to take another shot at something. If you've lost significant revenue and hung on, but you want to make improvements to your business and try and grow again, there's going to be capital available for you. And that's a big priority of the president's.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for today, but this was super helpful, and we really, really appreciate you being here. Next, I'd like to continue the discussion by welcoming Neil Bradley, the U.S. Chamber's Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer. Hi, Neil.
Good to be with you again.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
So we just heard from Bharat about how these changes to the PPP program will help smaller and minority-owned businesses. And now I'd like to turn to you, because you're our guru on exactly how businesses can make this happen for themselves. So let's see. Let's just start about these changes that we're talking about. What do they mean for smaller businesses, like actually on the ground? Is the application process the same? Like, what's the practical reality of these?
Yeah, let's focus on the two big changes that Bharat talked about and that the administration announced earlier this week. The first big change was that effective Wednesday, there will be an exclusive window through the end of March 9th for small businesses with less than 20 employees to apply for and receive PPP loans. Now, they didn't change the rules around who qualifies for PPP or the amount or the forgiveness or even the application. They simply said that we will only accept applications from lenders for PPP loans for businesses with fewer than 20 employees. So the rules haven't changed, but there are some important factors to consider that apply specifically to smaller employers. And let me start with the first one that has to do with the likely size of your loan and some of the paperwork requirements, both on initial application and then when you get to loan forgiveness. As we've talked about before, for the second draw PPP, meaning that you've already gotten one PPP loan, now you're going back and getting a second draw loan. One of the requirements is that you have to show that you had a 25% reduction in gross receipts in a calendar quarter of 2020 compared to the same calendar quarter in 2019. But when you pull up the SBA form for lenders, or for small businesses, one of the things it says is that if your loan amount is less than $150,000 or less, you don't have to provide the documentation upon application of that 25% reduction. So who does that apply to? If you think about a loan of $150,000 and you work backwards and you do the math, that essentially means that if your payroll is $60,000 or less a month, if it's less than $60,000, then your loan is likely to be under $150,000. And you don't have to get that documentation ready when you go in and make that application. So that's one way that it's just going to be a little bit easier in this window for businesses with fewer than 20 employees. In addition, remember that if your loan is less than $150,000, when you get to the loan forgiveness part of the program, you get to do the one-page simple form, and you don't have to do all of that documentation as well. One of the things they may look for, however, when you get to the loan forgiveness is, did you meet that 25% test? So while you don't have to get the documentation together today or next week, you will want to get it together by the time you get ready for loan forgiveness. So that's the first big change, is understanding how this exclusive window for under 20 employees, what allows you to take advantage of. The second big change really only applies to sole proprietors, the self-employed, and independent contractors. And it actually hasn't taken effect yet. It'll actually take effect, we believe, next Monday. And the change is When you're looking to calculate your loan amount and you go to your 1040 Schedule C, which line do you look at to calculate your income? Under the old rules, someone who is self-employed or an independent contractor would basically go down to the bottom and look at line 31, which is your net income from your self-employment and from your business. Of course, net income is what you get when you take your gross income and you do all the deductions for your business expenses. And that number can be quite a bit smaller. What they're proposing to do, what we expect to happen next week, is they're going to say you get to go to the top of the form. You get to go look at line 7, which is your gross income. And that's the income level that you use to calculate the value of your PPP loan. And for independent contractors and self-employed with lots of businesses expenses that you deduct, that can make a real difference in the size of your PPP loan.
Right, right. Before we have so much to cover, but before we go on, I want to ask you a question that I think I've asked you before. And that is, if I were applying for a PPP loan and technically I qualified for an amount over $150,000, but not like that much over, could you opt to just cap yourself at $150,000 because you know it's going to be much easier to apply for forgiveness?
You could, and so you're submitting your application based on your payroll costs and expenses, and if you want to borrow less, you can borrow less. And so I think if I were a small business and my loan amount was $151,000, I'd think long and hard about whether I wanted what the benefit of that extra $1,000 and the paperwork requirements.
Yeah, thank you. So we also talked with Bharat about how all these changes are helping minority businesses, and I wonder if you would also like to address that.
Well, I think Bharat hit it really well. The things that we know just based on the data about minority-owned businesses, they tend to be self-employed or smaller employers. And so, focusing the next 2 weeks on employers with fewer than 20, making the rule change for the self-employed, those are two things that are really going to help minority business owners. I think it's important to say that these rules apply to everyone. There's no one set of rules for minority business owners and a set of rules for not. The rules are the same across the board. But when you think about the people who maybe haven't been able to access the program or who maybe the benefit that they were getting because they're self-employed, really didn't match their economic need, these changes really do help that.
Yeah. Of all the things we've talked about so far, are all of these changes in effect already?
No, and that's an important point. And so the change for focusing on only accepting applications for under 20, that has taken effect already. That took effect yesterday morning and will run for 2 weeks. The changes on the self-employed, being able to go from that line 31 to line 7 and get the greater loan amount, the changes on the restrictions on eligibility that Bharat talked about, the SBA actually has to promulgate initial rules. We're expecting that will likely happen as soon as Monday. But if you're an independent contractor or sole proprietor and you're listening today and you're about to hit send on the form, you're going to want to wait. If this makes a difference between your gross and your net income, you're going to want to wait till next week when they promulgate those rules, because then you can take advantage of the rules change. Today, if your application is submitted, you won't be able to take advantage of that rules change.
Right. Okay. Bharat made the point that there would be money left in the program even after this 2-week window is over. Do you, Neil, have any insight into how much money is left in the program? And do you think it'll extend beyond March 31st?
I hope they do extend beyond March 31st. And one of the things that the U.S. Chamber that we're asking Congress to do is to provide an extension of the window and additional funding should that be necessary. I do think that we're monitoring the numbers. There remains quite a bit, several hundred billion remaining in the program. Over the next 2 weeks, we may have a high volume of loans, but because they're less than 20 employees, they're going to be smaller dollar amounts. So I do believe we will have resources left at the end of this 2 weeks. I do begin to worry a little bit about a rush at the end of March. And so my advice for anyone who is watching today, if you have fewer than 20 employees, take advantage of this window between now and March 10th. If you have more, 20 employees or more, get ready to, and you want to take advantage of a PPP loan, first or second draw, get ready to go when the window reopens for everyone else after March 10th. I don't think you want to be in a situation in which you're waiting till the last week of the month and run the risk that they might run out of money.
Just a clarification, the program ends March 31st as of now. Is that the last date you can apply, or is that the last date they can issue a loan?
That's a great question. It's certainly they won't accept applications into the portal. I think it's I don't know the answer whether if you got in under the portal and they haven't approved yet. I suspect it's when they close the portal, but I wouldn't want to take the risk.
Yeah. Okay. If you are a business who already got a PPP loan and is thinking about applying for another one, a second one, any new considerations people should be thinking about?
No, I don't think so. So the rules, the 25% reduction in a single calendar quarter, still apply. I don't expect that we're going to have major changes around the parameters of the program. Bharat talked about some of the things that are pending in this COVID American Rescue Plan that Congress is currently considering. We should talk about some of the new programs, but the changes around PPP that at least so far have been proposed won't fundamentally change it other than for larger nonprofits expanding the eligibility to larger nonprofits. But the rest of PPP remains intact. And so I would have no concerns about going in and applying that. I think it makes sense. But we should talk about some of those other programs that both exist and programs that we expect to come on the horizon.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you about those, but I do want to ask you a question. I see somebody put it in the chat. We didn't get to the Q&A yet, but I think this is a good question that I also am confused about. So if you are self-employed or a sole proprietor, you already applied and got your PPP loan, but it was a smaller amount because it was based on the original calculation, not on your gross income. Can you apply again now under the new rules?
So let's take this question in two parts. So the first part is, let's say we're talking about an original first draw PPP loan.
Yes.
And you look at it and you say, gosh, I could get more money. This is what Bharat was talking about. The SBA is going to have to issue new rules and guidance, because under the current rules, you wouldn't be able to go back and get the additional money. I think they're going to try to change that to make that possible. That's one of the things that Congress did before, one of the last times they changed the rules. And so I'm hopeful that the SBA is going to find a way to allow an individual to do that with the PPP loan that they've already gotten. Okay, let's take a different scenario. You got a first draw PPP as a sole proprietor, independent contractor. Now you're looking at a second draw. You meet the criteria. This is the question you asked Bharat. Do you have to have that 25% reduction? Yes. The 25% reduction in gross receipts applies to whether you're an employer or you're self-employed. Remember, that's a 25% reduction in your income in a quarter of calendar 2020 versus the same quarter in calendar 2019. But if you're applying for that second draw PPP loan, you meet that qualification and you wait until after the new rules come out, again, likely on Monday, then you'll maybe even get a bigger PPP loan for your second draw than you got for your first draw. So those are two ways to think about it. One way is if it's the first draw loan, we're waiting to see if the SBA can find a way for you to reapply to get more money. If you haven't gotten your second draw, wait till the new rules come out and you're going to be able to get more money than you did in your first draw PPP.
Got it. Thank you. Audience, we are going to go to your questions in about 5 minutes. So Neil, this is the time where we get to do a lightning round where we walk through all the other programs. And I'm going to start with your favorite, the employee retention tax credit. So tell us about that and what should people be doing right now to take advantage of that?
I love it. This is, remember, from January 1 to June 30th under current law, it's a 50% tax credit up to $7,000 per quarter per employee. That's $14,000. We're focused on employers with fewer than 500. You apply for this through the IRS. Your business does have to experience at least a 20% reduction in gross receipts in the calendar 2021 quarter compared to the same quarter in 2019. You will apply for this tax credit when you're remitting your payroll taxes at the end of the quarter and you're filling out your normal IRS forms there. There is the opportunity to go back, to look back into 2020 and claim the smaller tax credit that's available. It's up to $5,000 per employee, generally focused on employers with fewer than 100 employees. And you're going to want to be talking right now to your tax preparer, your bookkeeper about that. We were just in some conversations with some of the payroll processors. We're looking for additional guidance from the IRS to simplify this process because right now it's a little bit complicated. But the thing that you should be doing right now is talking to your bookkeeper, talking to your tax preparer, saying, I want to make sure I'm able to take advantage of this tax credit.
Yeah, and that's something people need to keep in mind is that it is often the payroll company that's going to be helping them with that and not necessarily just their accountant, which I think
That's exactly right.
Clear to people in the beginning. Let's talk about EIDL loans, economic injury disaster loans. Those were also an option early in the pandemic. Are they still an option for people now? These are loans that get paid back as opposed to.
So these are loans that get paid back. Yep, those still remain an option. I was on the SBA's website this morning. They're processing EIDL loans. So those disaster loans you can still apply for. There was also the EIDL targeted grant. This was the up to $10,000 grant that they exhausted all the money that was set aside for this really quickly. And one of the things that happened in December was they re-upped the money, but they said that we're going to target it to businesses in generally low-income areas, areas that qualify for the new market tax credit. And they said we're going to prioritize people who've already gotten an EIDL emergency grant, but didn't get the full amount. And I was on the SBA website, again, as I said, just this morning. They are actually reaching out. They, the SBA, are reaching out to people who got an SBA EIDL grant, but didn't get the full amount, and letting them know that they can now get the full amount. Then they're going to move to targeting people who applied for an EIDL grant, but didn't get it before the program ran out of money. So this is one where the SBA is reaching out to you. You can't reach out to the SBA.
Don't call us, we'll call you.
Exactly right. Exactly.
So speaking of that, shuttered venue grants, are they still a thing?
Well, they're going to be a thing. They're not a thing today, but they're going to be a thing. So these are the fairly large grants for live venue spaces, performance halls, comedy clubs, theaters, where you have performances and you charge people tickets. The SBA is still setting up this program. And so they are not currently accepting applications, but they are routinely updating their website. And we're hoping that any day now that they'll be able to open this program.
Great. Anything else you want to talk about for minority-owned businesses? Any other programs?
They have not created any new kind of special programs. So, it's really being able to take advantage of these programs that we've talked about already.
Great. Okay. Before we go to Q&A, just one more question for you. There's a new pandemic relief bill in Congress right now. Just kind of what are you, Bharat talked a little bit about it, but what are you anticipating we might actually see? Yeah,
so a couple things. Let's first start with an extension of the employee retention tax credit. I mentioned a little bit ago, $7,000 per employee, but per quarter, but only for the first 2 quarters of 2021. This bill extends it through the end of the calendar year. So that's one of the reasons I hope people take advantage of it, because it could be a program that's around all year, and that can make a really big difference. The second is for restaurants, caterers, bars. We know how hard hit they've been. The proposed bill includes a $25 billion grant program, not a loan, a grant program for those restaurants, bars, caterers. Importantly, it is a grant that essentially gives you the difference between your gross receipts pre-pandemic, 2019, and your gross receipts during the pandemic, 2020. And if you have fewer than 20 locations, you can get a grant up to $5 million per location, $10 million total overall for the business itself. And so, it's really simple. It's how much did you make before? How much did you make during the pandemic? Calculate the difference, and you can get a grant for that difference up to that cap. Now, again, that's not law yet. It's still got to pass the House, got to pass the Senate, got to be signed by the president. But we're watching it really closely, because if this does become law, we're going to want to let everyone who's listening in who could be impacted know exactly how they take advantage of that.
Great, thank you. Neil, we're going to go to questions from the audience now. We have a lot of them, and I'll just go right through them. Okay, so this person says, we know that originally with the PPP loans, you had to spend a certain percentage of your loan on payroll. Is that different if you're a sole proprietor? Because your payroll is obviously quite small. So how does that impact how you can spend the loan?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. And just to remind everyone, if you're an employer, for loan forgiveness, 60% of your forgiveness has to go for payroll costs. Obviously, for sole proprietors to self-employed, this worked well under the net income test, because your net income test was what you had left over after your expenses. It's unclear if there's going to be some change that they need to make once they move to that gross income test. We'll want to come back to this, but the general assumption has been, and I hope that this is the assumption in the current program, and I hope that the assumption that they continue when they release the revisions next week is that if you're self-employed or a sole proprietor or an independent contractor, the assumption is that all of your loan proceeds are actually your payroll costs. So that's the assumption, the way it operates now. Hopefully it remains that way when the new revisions come out next week.
Meaning they can spend all of it on payroll.
Meaning the assumption is it's all for payroll. And so that we're not making you document where the money was spent, because the assumption is that the whole thing is going to support your income.
Right. Okay. So this next question, which is a popular one, and we sort of already covered, but I want to make sure I understood it and the audience understands it. So because of the changes in how you qualify for a PPP loan now, if you're a sole proprietor, if you already got one, you sort of have two options at this point. We're waiting on guidance, I think you said, to know if the change means that you can reapply and get more money. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Whether you can go back to your lender and say, hey, look, the rules changed. I was entitled to more money. I would like to modify the loan I've already received. And that's what we're hoping the SBA is going to say next week that you're allowed to do. Can't do that today. We're hopeful that they're going to say you are allowed to do that.
But if that didn't happen, could you not just apply for a second PPP loan?
You could. Now, remember, you'll still have to meet the 25% reduction in income in a calendar quarter in 2020 versus 2019. But as long as you pass that test, you can apply for the second draw PPP, and you're likely to get an even bigger amount in the second draw than you got in the first draw, because you're taking advantage of the new rules.
Okay. We've had this question a lot. If you are receiving pandemic unemployment assistance, can you also get a PPP loan?
Yeah, you remember, you can't get the benefit for the same income. And so there may be a period of time where you're compensating yourself with the PPP program proceeds, and then another time where you're getting the pandemic unemployment. But as a general matter, can't take $2 for the same for the same dollar of expenditure.
This person asks, we are owned by a foreign non-US citizen. So under this new regulation, are they eligible for forgiveness?
They have not changed the rules on foreign ownership. And so there were some pretty complicated rules regarding, depending on, is it wholly owned? Is it partially owned? Those rules have not changed, and we don't anticipate them changing.
I remember that when PPP was first introduced, you had to be in business as of like February 15th, 2020, or something close to that to qualify. This person asks, what if we open right before COVID? How would we show a revenue loss? So assume that they met the date, right? Like, let's assume they opened on February 18th or whatever that made them technically qualify. But how would they show a revenue loss based on the previous year?
Yeah, so there are special rules for you. So if you were open, let's say 2 quarters of 2019, you get to basically use a special formula that only looks at those quarters. If you just opened February 1, 2020, and you weren't open before, you basically get to compare back-to-back quarters in 2020 for that purpose. So there are options for you to show that the pandemic caused your revenue loss. And in fact, when you go to the second draw PPP loan form, it walks through the 4 separate calculations or options for you based on the date that you opened.
Similar question. If you are a seasonal business, how do you figure out the number of employees, since in March you may have, so they're asking if they even qualify during this 2-week window, because in some parts of the year they have fewer than 20 employees, and then in some parts of the year they have more than 20 employees.
Well, that's a great question. Obviously there are rules for seasonal employment. We haven't seen anything in the information that the administration put out on treating seasonal employers differently. I suspect what you're going to find, just from a sheer practical standpoint, is that if you're submitting a loan application, on the loan application, you have to identify your number of employees. And if the number that you're identifying, because you're a seasonal employer and you're calculating from that seasonal time period, is above 20, they're not going to process it. If you're submitting an application, the number of employees is below 20, they're going to process that. So they didn't make any special rules this week for seasonal employers.
Okay, so we've talked about if you got a PPP loan, but it was for a smaller amount than you would qualify for under the new rules, what you would do in that instance. But I don't know if we covered this person's question, which was if you applied the first time and got denied, but think that you now would qualify because of the change in the rules, can you reapply?
Yes, and you should. If you think, and by the way, I suspect that there are a lot of sole proprietors and self-employed who did the paperwork and looked at the bottom and said, we've heard of people who, once they ran the calculations, they qualified for a $100 loan. And it was just like, it's not worth it. And so if you didn't apply because of that, or you applied and denied and you think you qualified now, you should go and apply for the loan.
This is an interesting question, and I want us to address it. This person says, I am a minority woman-owned business with fewer than 20 employees, and I think they already got their PPP loan. So they're saying, so did I now miss out on some opportunity? No, right?
No, you didn't miss out on any opportunities. So the rules are exactly the same, leaving aside the self-employed and the independent contractors, the sole proprietors. If you have employees, the rules are exactly the same today as they were last week. And so you didn't miss out on anything. I'm just glad you got your loan already.
Yeah. Okay, we have a couple bank-related questions, and I don't know for sure that you'll know the answer, but the first is, if my bank is not an approved PPP lender, where do I go to get a PPP loan?
Yeah, you need to go find a lender who is. And so there are, in fact, if you go to the SBA website, there's a connection tool to help you find lenders who participate. Remember, credit unions, traditional banks can participate, CDFIs, certain fintech companies, these are online banks, essentially are participating and providing loans. So there are lots of options out there. If you're at the bank that you use today for your traditional banking doesn't do it, go find a bank who does. There are lots of them out there.
I put in a little plug for Co. On the Watch Live page, we have an article posted under the window where you're watching, where you can find some non-bank PPP loan lenders. There's a good.
Oh, that's great. That's a great resource. Yeah, because sometimes those are fast and easy. So that's great.
Yeah. This person says, and I know that a lot of very small businesses are in this situation. They use their personal banking account for business. Do you think that the bank requires you have a separate business bank account?
I've not heard of that being a barrier for businesses. So you want to talk to your lender to make sure, but I at least have not run across that so far as people telling me that that's a barrier.
We talked about the loan application and qualification process, but not about the forgiveness terms. Has that changed?
The forgiveness terms have not changed, so those remain the same. And of course, obviously, the two best pieces of news out of the bill that got enacted on December 27th is one, your PPP loan forgiveness will not be taxed. There is no negative tax treatment for PPP loans. You can still deduct all of your business expenses on your taxes just like you normally do, even if you pay for those business expenses with PPP loans, and you don't have to pay tax on the loan forgiveness. The second bit of good news, if your loan is less than $150,000, you get to use that one-page simple form.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, was about the taxability of it. But if you are a small business who got a PPP loan, you probably should expect that you'll still need to provide documentation with your taxes that you got the loan. It's not like you pretend you didn't get it, right?
Yeah, there may be some documentation issues, and I know lots of people have been working through the accounting issues, right? They're trying to maintain good, healthy books, and now we have this thing that, like, where do you put it in your bookkeeping structure? And so, yeah, those are things obviously you'll want to work through. But at least on the tax man side, they're not going to come tax you.
This person's asking.
I would say this has become a debate in a lot of states. So I don't want to lead people astray. There are some states who are saying, no, we are going to tax the loan forgiveness. And so we've been working with lots of chambers across the country to get states to fix that, because you shouldn't, if the federal guy's not taxing you, I hope your state government's not going to tax you either.
But just to clarify on that, the state would only be taxing you on the amount of state taxes that you owe, not on your federal tax.
Correct. That's exactly right. Yeah.
There's confusion here, and there has been since the beginning, about the difference between the original PPP loan and a second draw PPP loan. But there's really no difference, right? It's just that you can apply again if you want to. But can you clarify that?
Yeah, so there are really only two. Well, I guess I would say I'm going to describe three differences. The first two differences have to do with eligibility. And for the second draw PPP loan, it's 300 or fewer employees. For the first draw, it was 500 or fewer. So if you have 400 employees, you might qualify for the first draw PPP, but not the second draw. The second change that has to do with eligibility is this 25% reduction in gross receipts test that we've talked about. Under the original PPP, you didn't have to show a decline in your income. Under the second draw, you got to show that you meet that 25% reduction in gross receipts test. The third change I would mention really has to do if you're in the accommodation or hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels. If you're in what they call the NAICS Code 72, that's that industry sector. If you're in that industry, if that's your business, then you actually get to apply for a little bit larger of an amount of a loan than everyone else does. For everyone else, the calculation is 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs. If you're in the accommodation, hospitality, NAICS 72 industries, then for you, it's 3.5 times your average monthly payroll. So other than those three changes, the second draw and the first draw are really the same.
And just to clarify, if you haven't gotten a PPP loan at all, you can apply for the first time right now. If you got one, you can apply for the second time right now.
That's exactly right.
Right now. Okay. If I got one now and wanted to apply somehow for another one before March 31st, technically I might be able to do that, although I'm not sure.
You may. It depends on the size of the loan amount. So one of the criteria for the second draw, maybe this is one of the criteria for the second draw is that by the time your second draw loan is dispersed to you, you have to have exhausted your first draw loan. And so if you're getting if you expect disbursement of the second draw by March 31st, you will have had to use all of your first round PPP loan by that date.
I'm going to do something now that seems dangerous, and I try to never do it, which is to ask you a question that I myself don't fully understand the question, but I think it's important, so I'm hoping you will. It says, can you explain how PPP and the employee retention tax credit work together? 70% of employee wages are covered with the ERTC. Can the remaining 30% be credited with PPP?
So what this person's asking about, really smart question, is they're trying to figure, you can't get the employee retention tax credit for the same wages that you paid for using PPP loan proceeds. So let's put this in personal terms. Let's say that you're paying Bob in the month of February with money from your PPP loan. You can't then turn around and claim the employee retention tax credit for those same wages that you paid Bob with the PPP loans. So people are trying to figure out, how do you stack these? Because you can take advantage of both. And what the questioner is asking is as an attempt to say, well, part of Bob's wages were paid for with the PPP and part of them weren't paid for, but with the PPP. That's one way of doing it, I think, although that's really complicated. And I think you may run into some issues as you try to document that. Another way of doing it is to simply say, we used our PPP loan to pay Bob in January and February. By March, we've exhausted our PPP loan, and now we're continuing to pay Bob without PPP loan proceeds. So then you take the employee retention tax credit for March, and then for April and May and June. And so you simply say, this is the window where we paid our employees with the PPP, and here's the window where we paid our employees with the employee retention tax credit. That's the easiest way to do it. The questioner says, well, maybe I can slice and dice in the same month. Maybe you might be able to do that. I'd really want to see when IRS issues new guidance on that, but that becomes really complicated to do, in my opinion.
Now, all of that said, on top of that, if you did everything you just said, could you also deduct your payroll as a business expense?
So you continue on the PPP side, you continue to deduct your payroll as a business expense, whether you pay for it with your PPP loans or not.
Okay, that's a good question. Rehiring employees. In the beginning, the first PPP loan, you had to prove that you were rehiring your employees by June 30th, I think it was. What are the dates for that now? What are the requirements for rehiring employees right now?
So the rehiring requirement does remain in effect. If you took a reduction in your employee headcount or in compensation above a certain threshold, then you had to restore the compensation or restore the employees. Over the course of the past year, those deadlines were extended. It's essentially been extended to rehires by December 31st of last year. They've also added multiple safe harbors where if your business won't support rehiring, you can utilize a safe harbor there because your business is off. If you can't find employees to hire, you can take advantage of that safe harbor there. Generally speaking, the date keeps moving out, but at some point, if you had 100 employees, last February, March, February, you reduced that in March, and you applied for the loan based on the 100 employees, you either have to get those 100 headcount back or take advantage of one of the safe harbors.
Great. We have time for 2 more quick questions. I know there were some changes previously about nonprofits qualifying for PPP loans. Just remind us if you're a nonprofit, who qualifies?
Yeah, so if you're a 501c3, fewer than 500 employees, you qualify. One of the big issues was about 501c6s, chambers of commerce, trade associations, destination market organizations, travel and tourism bureaus. They originally did not qualify because they were C6s, and then the December law, an expansion was made so that C6s do qualify. There's some special rules about them, about number of employees, and also not using revenue or expenses related to lobbying, which I think those organizations generally know about. But that was the big change in December.
Great. One more for you. Assuming that the program gets extended beyond March 31st, which we don't know if that will happen, but if that were to happen, do you anticipate that there's enough money there and that they might consider a third dip for people to apply for a third loan?
Yeah, first, we don't know that the deadline is going to be extended. And the bill that's currently pending in the House of Representatives that they're going to vote on either by the end of this weekend, we expect, there is not an extension of the March 31st deadline. I'm not terribly bullish on a third draw PPP. There's not much discussion on Capitol Hill about a third draw. I think what you're seeing instead is these more targeted programs for the really hard hit industry. So in the December bill, we had the Shuttered venue grant program, right? In this bill that's currently pending, we have this special fund just for restaurants, bars, catering services. I think that's, if there's any additional left that needs to be done, maybe we'll see something there, but I don't see a third draw PPP. I do see extension of the employee retention tax credit. So that's a good thing, and that benefits all employers, but I don't see a third round of PPP in the cards at the moment.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. That's all we have time for today. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Bharat. For more resources, you can look under the watch window on the page you're looking at now. And we have a lot of articles and all of the previous small business updates that I've done with Neil, which are full of great information. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And we will be with you next time. We have more information to share. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone.